Yesterday's athletes, demobilized soldiers, taxi drivers, and ordinary workers formed gangs that would soon be given a new, grandiose name: organized crime groups. They didn't ask for anything or seek anyone's permission. They simply took lives, money, businesses, entire cities. Their power was in reality much more tangible and frightening than that of the police or the state. The state seemed distant and abstract, but the gangsters were right there, in your yard, at your market, in your city. They dictated the rules, carried out vigilante justice, and handed down sentences from which there was no appeal or pardon. A bullet in the back of the head in a stairwell or a noose around the neck in a dark forest became commonplace. Moscow and St. Petersburg, Tolyatti and Ryazan, Ekaterinburg and dozens of other cities. The map of Russia was quickly covered with red spots of criminal wars. Slonovsk, Orkhov, Tambov, Volgograd. These names sounded almost like frontline reports, and in a sense, it was a real front. Every day, blood was shed on the streets of Russian cities. Cars and stairwells were blown up, restaurants were destroyed by explosions. Killers worked without days off, and city morgues were overwhelmed by the number of corpses. The law enforcement system, impoverished and demoralized, proved incapable of countering this wave. Police officers were paid pennies, and their technical equipment looked like a pitiful parody compared to the arsenal of criminals. Many couldn't take it and broke down, switching to the criminal side. They traded information, weapons, and at the same time, freedom and human lives. Those who remained honest and stubborn continued to fight, but this struggle resembled a hopeless attempt to scoop out the ocean with a teaspoon. Excited cases fell apart one after another, captured murderers were released by corrupt judges, and smirking gangsters with blood on their hands walked free right out of the courtroom. In offices with walls yellowed from smoke, a feeling far worse than fatigue was born, a feeling of complete helplessness. People in uniform and with epaulets felt a dull rage burning inside them. Evil was being done before their very eyes, but it was impossible to punish it according to the law. It was in this atmosphere of universal fear and a paralyzed state that the legend began to gain strength. At first, it was a whisper in criminal circles. Then rumors spread through the streets and finally leaked into the newspapers. People talked about the White Arrow. Who were they? Hunters? Ghosts? No one knew for sure. But the images that appeared more often in the mid-1990s looked the same. A highway outside Moscow. Dawn. On the side of the road, a convoy of expensive foreign cars. The doors are open, and there are signs of a struggle inside. There are neat bullet holes in the windows. The silence around them was almost deafening. Not a single body. Neither in the cars nor nearby. Only shell casings, and unusual ones at that. Not from gangsters' weapons, but from weapons that were only used by special forces. And then the rumors began. Another crime boss had disappeared along with his entire security detail. Gone without a trace. As if he had dissolved into thin air. The police opened cases, but every investigation reached a dead end. No witnesses, no motives, no leads. Competitors? No, they acted brutally and always sought to boast of their victories. Here, everything was clean, calculated, and without a single mistake. Then who? And at some point, in the prosecutor's offices, leafing through the protocols, the investigators whispered, "It's them again." And everyone understood who they were talking about. About ghosts. About those very Avengers whom no one had ever seen, but everyone knew existed. The legend of the White Arrow quickly became embellished with terrifying details. Some claimed that it was a secret unit, born in the depths of the FSB or GRU. Others said it was a squad of the best. Former Alpha and Vimple fighters, veterans of Afghanistan and Chechnya, professionals who knew how to kill quickly, quietly, and without the slightest mercy. People who had been given free rein by the state. Rumor had it that they had been given an unofficial license to hunt down the most notorious and lawless bandits, those who could not be put behind bars by legal means. And the idea itself seemed frighteningly logical. If the law is powerless to protect citizens, then the state responds with illegal methods. It creates a death squad that operates according to the ancient principle of an eye for an eye. No courts, no lawyers, No right to justification. Only one reward, a bullet. The criminal world, accustomed to its own concepts and rules of the game, faced an enemy that could not be bought or outplayed. This enemy did not bargain, did not negotiate, did not divide territory. He simply came and took lives. First, at night, on deserted highways. Then, right in suburban cottages, past armed guards. People who, just yesterday, considered themselves masters of life, felt real, clinging fear for the first time. It was not fear of a competitor who could be identified and eliminated. It was fear of a faceless machine of destruction, systematic and relentless. The point of no return came with the elephant case. If earlier the White Arrow was whispered about only as a legend, by the mid-1990s it had taken on flesh and blood. And it happened in Ryazan. One of Russia's most brutal and bloody organized crime groups, the Slonovskaya Gang, ruled there unchallenged. Its leaders, former taxi driver Nikolai Maximov, known as Max, and former deputy prosecutor Vyacheslav Ermolov, nicknamed Slon, Elephant, built an entire criminal empire. They killed easily and ruthlessly. All it took was refusing to pay tribute, giving a sidelong glance, or saying a careless word, and a person was dead. Dozens of entrepreneurs were buried, hundreds were maimed. The Slonovskaya organized crime group became famous for its mass killings. The most notorious episode was when the gangsters took 8 members of a rival gang into the forest and shot them at point-blank range without a moment's hesitation. For them, it was just a demonstration of power. They felt like gods, confident that the law did not apply to them and that they would never be punished. But just when they were at the height of their power, strange and frightening events began to occur in Ryazan. One by one, key members of the Elephants began to disappear. And these were not ordinary foot soldiers, but the people closest to the leaders, the most brutal and dangerous killers. The scenario repeated itself with frightening accuracy. In the evening, a gangster would leave a restaurant or his home, get into his car, and disappear. No one ever saw him again. Later, only abandoned cars were found, in junkyards, on deserted highways, near forest roads. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if the people had vanished into thin air. The gang leaders panicked. They increased security, began to travel only in motorcades, surrounded themselves with dozens of armed men, but it didn't help. The disappearances continued. It looked like a targeted purge, methodical, cold, flawless. Someone with perfect knowledge of the Slonov's routes and schedule was picking off the gang's most valuable fighters. Panic broke out within the group. Suspicions of betrayal and working for the enemy ate away at the collective from within. The gangsters began to settle scores with each other, which further weakened their position. And that's when persistent rumors began to spread throughout Ryazan. The White Arrow is at work. People whispered that the local security forces, tired of banging their heads against a brick wall, had turned to Moscow for help. And from there, they sent in the cleaners. From that moment on, the legend ceased to be just a scary tale used to intimidate. For the first time, the gangsters felt that there was a force capable of catching up with any of them, regardless of rank, wealth, or number of bodyguards. This was the first real blow to the psychology of the criminal world. The legend of the White Arrow turned into a weapon that did not need to be held in the hands. It struck the mind and nerves, undermined confidence, sowed fear, and destroyed even the most united groups from within. The point of no return had been passed. Now, every authority figure who disappeared anywhere in the country was automatically attributed to the work of mysterious avengers. The legend took on a life of its own, overgrown with hundreds of versions and speculations. Soon, no one could say with certainty what was true and what was fiction. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed in the White Arrow. And it was this belief that changed the rules of the game. Thus, a new reality emerged, the psychology of fear. Rumors ceased to be mere gossip in the back alleys. The arrow became an independent phenomenon, a kind of instrument of pressure that worked no worse than automatic weapons and explosives. In a world where information was valued more than gold, uncertainty became the most terrible enemy. The White Arrow was the embodiment of this uncertainty. Now any disappearance, Any unsolved murder in the woods was viewed exclusively through the prism of the arrow. Gangsters began to live in an atmosphere of constant suspicion, which reached the level of paranoia. Trust, already shaky in their world, evaporated completely. Everyone began to see their neighbor at the table or their brother as a possible traitor, secretly collaborating with the ghostly avengers. Yesterday's comrades turned into enemies, looking at each other with caution and distrust. Any mistake, any slip-up in the criminal world could be interpreted as betrayal or collaboration with the elusive cleaners. This led to bloody internal reprisals. Leaders of organized crime groups, driven to hysteria by fear of an invisible enemy, began to exterminate their own entourage, seizing on the slightest hint, a careless word, or empty gossip. Sometimes a sidelong glance or an ambiguous joke was enough for a person to be taken out to the forest at night and buried there without a trace. Thus, even if the White Arrow never actually existed, it fulfilled its main task. It forced the gangs to devour themselves from within. Ordinary people, tired of lawlessness, secretly rejoiced at this terrible justice. Yes, it was cruel, dark, and illegal, but for many, it was still better than the complete powerlessness of the state. In kitchen conversations and smoke-filled smoking rooms, the legend of the shooter acquired new details, turning into the folklore of a new era. He was a kind of Robin Hood of the 90s. Only he did not share his loot with the poor, but simply wiped out those whom the people hated. But the myth did not remain within the confines of Ryazan. Like a virus, it spread rapidly throughout the country, finding fertile ground in every city where gangs held power. In Tolyatti, the automotive capital of Russia, one of the bloodiest wars in the history of domestic crime was raging. Dozens of gangs fought for control of the giant AvtoVAZ, and there too, people began to whisper about the mysterious arrow. In the 1990s, murders became routine, literally put on stream. But it was then, against the backdrop of endless shooting and explosions, that disappearances began to occur that stood out from the usual pattern of criminal showdowns. In Tolyatti, a city where a real meat grinder was going on for control of AvtoVAZ, influential gang leaders disappeared one after another. Those who controlled the shipment of cars and spare parts vanished as if they had dissolved into thin air. Sometimes they were found weeks or months later, and sometimes never. Officially, it was all blamed on competitors, but sometimes the handwriting was too clean and neat. There was none of the cruelty typical of gang wars. At such moments, people whispered, "It looks like the Moscow gangsters." The very same arrow. In St. Petersburg, where power was divided between the Tambov and Malyshev gangs, the legend of the White Arrow took on a political dimension. The city was shaken by high-profile murders, such as the shooting of Vice Governor Mikhail Manovich. An atmosphere of uncertainty reigned. No one understood where crime ended and politics began. Crazy theories were born in the investigators' offices. What if this is not a usual showdown? What if it's a third force, achieving its goals through others? The figure of the White Arrow fit perfectly into such conspiracy theories, becoming a convenient explanation for any murder that did not fit into the logic of crime. Even in the Far East, in the lair of the old school of thieves-in-law, where their power seemed eternal and unshakable, similar rumors began to circulate. Strange incidents were happening there too neat to be the work of local gangs. The pattern was universal, a faceless, all-powerful enemy who demanded no ransom and left no bodies behind. Very soon, criminal leaders realized that the legend of the White Arrow could not only be used to scare their subordinates, but also to skillfully cover up their own affairs. The myth of the White Arrow very quickly ceased to be just a scary tale that gangsters used to frighten each other. It became a convenient tool that the most cunning and cynical leaders of organized crime groups learned to use. Why wage open war with competitors, waste resources, and risk people's lives when you can act much more subtly? It was enough to quietly and carefully eliminate a rival and then spread the rumor, "It wasn't us. It was the work of the Arrow." For credibility, they imitated the signature of mythical avengers. The murders were carried out with special weapons, either military or supposedly service weapons, which were easily obtained through corrupt officers. Sometimes the bodies of the murdered were hidden without a trace, emphasizing the ghostly nature of the perpetrators. And sometimes, on the contrary, they were left in plain sight, demonstratively, as if it were a public execution of another lawless person. Everything was done to intimidate the rest and strengthen their belief in a terrible force from which it was impossible to hide. This move proved to be brilliant. First, it diverted suspicion away from the real instigators. After all, it was most convenient to blame the murder on mysterious ghosts. Secondly, the myth itself grew even stronger. Each new story fueled the legend, turning it into a force unto itself. As a result, the criminal world began to devour itself, feeding the fear that paralyzed even the most confident and ruthless players. Thus, the White Arrow became a kind of brand, a franchise without an owner that could be exploited by any sufficiently calculating and ruthless criminal leader. Real operations, if they existed at all, became so intertwined with gangster stagings that it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. At that time, silent confusion reigned in official structures. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and the FSB publicly denied the very possibility of the existence of death squads. To admit otherwise would mean signing off on their own impotence and violation of the laws on which the state was based. But behind the scenes, in private conversations, operatives and investigators who had been fighting crime for years and losing comrades did not hide their grim satisfaction. For them, every authority figure who disappeared or every organized crime boss who was killed was a small but still a victory. They did not know who was doing it, but somewhere deep down they approved. This was precisely the case when the end justified the means. The state tacitly accepted the existence of People's Avengers somewhere in the shadows, because they took on the dirtiest and bloodiest work that the official system could not or would not do. But at the same time, an official response was emerging. It was not hidden or legendary, but quite real, legally formalized, and no less harsh for that. In 1993, regional departments for combating organized crime appeared in Russia, the legendary RUBOBs. This was a completely new phenomenon for the post-Soviet police. Fighters who were given the broadest powers, the best weapons available at the time, and virtually carte blanche to use any methods, even the most harsh ones. These were no longer tired local police officers in worn jackets and with empty eyes, but angry, well-trained, motivated operatives and special forces. Their task was not simply to investigate individual crimes. They were tasked with completely destroying and eliminating criminal gangs, crushing them as a social phenomenon. RUBO operations increasingly resembled combat operations. Sudden raids on crimson cottages, mass arrests right on the tracks, harsh interrogations, and beating out confessions. They were assisted by SOBR units, rapid response special forces, and these guys didn't stand on ceremony. Faces on the floor, blows with rifle butts, total psychological pressure. Resistance was broken quickly and ruthlessly. Over time, this became their trademark style. And it was the activities of the RUBOPs that largely fueled and materialized the legend of the White Arrow. For the average person or even an ordinary fighter in an organized crime group, there was no particular difference. A secret death squad or official security forces in masks and camouflage who burst into a house in the middle of the night looked the same. Both were faceless people who brought violence, fear, and the inevitability of punishment. When RUBOPs fighters took out the entire leadership of a gang during a large-scale operation, and nothing was heard about those people for weeks or months while the investigation was conducted behind closed doors, rumors instantly began to spread. People whispered, "The Arrow took them." Thus, the real work of the state in cleaning up crime and the myth of secret avengers gradually merged into one, reinforcing and fueling each other. RUOP became the tangible, legal embodiment of the force that gangsters had previously feared only in rumors. It was a pivotal event in that invisible war. The state, albeit with a huge delay, finally began to deliver a real, systematic response. But it was at this very moment that the first cracks began to appear in the myth of the White Arrow. It was one thing for people to disappear mysteriously without a trace, but quite another when the leaders of organized crime groups found themselves alive in the dock. There, deprived of their security, money, and the usual aura of permissiveness, they looked not like formidable masters of life, but like frightened people ready to talk. The turning point was the defeat of the notorious Ryazan Slonov group. Its leaders, Nikolai Maximov, nicknamed Max, and former deputy prosecutor Vyacheslav Yermolov, nicknamed Slon, Elephant, ended up in the hands not of the elusive Arrow, but as a result of the long, painstaking, and dangerous work of the Rubwa and the prosecutor's office. When they were taken to the detention center, the gang's monolithic silence finally cracked. During interrogations, details began to emerge that sent a chill down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. The testimony included dozens of murders, endless racketeering, and mass reprisals. But the most shocking thing was that the truth about those very disappearances, which had long been attributed to the White Arrow, began to come to light. It turned out that a significant part of the missing Slonovites were not destroyed by mythical avengers at all, but by their own people. Ermolov Slon, obsessed with paranoia and persecution mania, saw traitors and betrayers everywhere. He personally gave orders to liquidate his own fighters. The slightest suspicion of ties to the police or competitors became a death sentence for a person. The fear of a mythical external enemy proved to be stronger than even the fear of their own boss. But during the investigation, it turned out that many of the missing Slonovci members were not victims of the legendary White Arrow, but of ordinary competitive wars. Other gangs quickly realized the benefits of the legend and learned to use it masterfully. They kidnapped and killed members of the Slonovka group, carefully copying the style of the special services. Precise shots, disappearance of bodies, hints of professionals. The panic that flared up within the organized crime group worked better for them than any direct shootout. The culmination of these revelations was testimony about the existence of the so-called Militia Brigade in Ryazan. It was a group of werewolves in uniform, active police officers who turned murder and kidnapping into a business. For money from competitors, they eliminated the people they wanted, taking advantage of all the benefits of their official position. Access to classified information, weapons, and the ability to cover their tracks cleanly in a way that no criminal could. It turned out to be not the White Arrow, not a secret state order, and not noble avengers, but an ordinary and therefore even more frightening reality: corruption, greed, and crime that had sprouted right in the bowels of the law enforcement system. The testimony that leaked to the press and the case files became the first nail in the coffin of a beautiful myth. It turned out that behind the mask of the mysterious liquidators were paranoid leaders who destroyed their own people, cunning competitors who faked other people's handwriting, and corrupt security forces who made money on blood. The monolithic, frighteningly correct legend of the White Arrow began to crumble into dozens of ugly and unpleasant stories. It gradually became clear that the White Arrow phenomenon had no single center or secret headquarters. It was chaos, in which everyone solved their own problems, and the myth served as a convenient screen and universal explanation. The verdict of history turned out to be completely different from what the romanticized rumors had expected. The culmination of the war on organized crime in the 1990s was not shootouts in the streets or mysterious disappearances. It was the courtrooms. Slow, drawn-out, formal trials that dragged on for years proved to be more terrifying than any bullet or explosion. It was there, under the cold light of the courtroom lamps, that the myth of the White Arrow was finally debunked and buried under tons of criminal cases. The trial of the leaders of the Slonovskaya organized crime group was indicative. The former rulers of Ryazan, who until recently had dictated their rules to the city, found themselves in the dock and were forced to answer not only for their own crimes, but also for those that for many years had been attributed to the legendary Avengers. One by one, the surviving militants began to talk, saving their own lives. Their confessions repeatedly destroyed the myth, revealing the monstrous but prosaic truth. It turned out that one of the most brutal killers, whose disappearance was considered the hallmark of the Arrow, was killed by his own comrades on the orders of the leader, simply because he was suspected of hiding part of the common fund. Another was eliminated by the very same militia brigade of werewolves in uniform, who simply carried out the order of their competitors for a few $1,000s. The third fell victim to internal backroom struggles and became a bargaining chip in the fight for power within the group. The trial proceeded methodically, episode by episode, revealing this dark underbelly. Every mysterious disappearance, every clean job attributed to the mythical White Arrow, found a simple and ugly explanation: greed, paranoia, betrayal, avarice. No noble avengers, no higher justice. Just a primitive struggle for power and money, where human life was expendable. The sentences handed down were life imprisonment and decades of strict regime for the leaders of the Slonov and other large organized crime groups throughout the country. The state, however slow and bureaucratic it may be, still managed to catch up with the gangster kings. Not with the mythical hand of the White Arrow, but with the very real and cold hand of the law. And it turned out that the prospect of slowly rotting away alive within prison walls frightened these people much more than instant death from a bullet somewhere in a dark forest. The court and the sentences became more terrifying to them than any legend. Of course, there were still some dark spots. Dozens of criminal leaders are still listed as missing. Their bodies were never found, their fate dissolved into darkness, forever becoming fodder for new rumors, tales, and conspiracy theories. But these were just fragments of a bygone era. The overall picture that emerged in courtrooms across the country was clear. The White Arrow was a smokescreen, a convenient myth that hid the true nature of the criminal wars, a chaotic, senseless, and self-destructive bloodbath in which the titans of the 1990s collapsed. With the advent of the 2000s, the country itself changed. The era of wild, primitive capitalism and street lawlessness was becoming a thing of the past. It was replaced by a rigid state power structure. The new rules of the game were no longer dictated by gangsters, but in the Kremlin offices. And in these new realities, there was no place left for the old-style organized crime groups. Their time was irrevocably over. The fate of the survivors varied, but was almost always unenviable. The leaders of the largest gangs, those who managed to avoid death in the internecine wars of the 1990s, went to live out their lives behind bars, in special regime colonies such as Black Dolphin or Polar Owl. Yesterday they were all-powerful, surrounded by bodyguards, keeping entire cities in fear, and today they are frail and sick old men in gray prison uniforms. Those who were lower in rank and managed to avoid prison tried to adapt to the new reality. Some hastily legalized themselves, turning into respectable businessmen with security guards, offices, and connections in power. But their criminal past forever followed them like a heavy shadow, turning them into easy prey for a new generation of law enforcement officers. Others chose to flee, to Spain, Greece, Thailand, where they disappeared into obscurity, burning through the remains of their stolen millions and constantly looking over their shoulders, waiting for retribution. Many did not live to see a peaceful old age. They were killed in the 2000s, during the last dying embers of the criminal wars or on the orders of former comrades who sought to eliminate witnesses to their turbulent past. But the fate of those on the other side of the barricades was also tragic. The heroes of the Rubwa, the officers who bore the brunt of that war, found themselves unnecessary in the new stable Russia. Their methods, harsh and ruthless, effective in the 1990s, were now considered excessive. In 2008, the organized crime departments themselves were disbanded. The best fighters either retired early or were pushed out of the system because they did not fit into the new, softer order. They won their war, but were forgotten in the new world that had dawned. And what about those very same werewolves in uniform? The infamous police brigade from Ryazan and their counterparts in other regions. Justice caught up with them too. But they were judged much more severely than ordinary bandits, because they had betrayed not the code, but their oath. Their story became a grim symbol of how the system, in trying to fight the disease, became infected with it from within. The era that gave rise to the legend of the White Arrow came to an end. Loud shootouts and explosions in the streets were replaced by the silence of bureaucrats' offices, where they no longer divided up markets, but budget flows and government contracts. Crime did not disappear, it just changed its appearance. Instead of crimson jackets, there were expensive suits from Italian brands. Instead of a pistol, there was a pen signing the necessary papers. It had become different, refined, legalized. And in this new reality, the White Arrow was no longer needed. So did the White Arrow exist? The answer to this question is both simple and complex. Literally speaking, no, there was no single secret unit officially authorized by the state to systematically take out criminals. Over the years, not a single piece of reliable evidence has been found to support this version. The reality, as the investigation and the courts showed, turned out to be much more mundane, chaotic, and cruel. However, if we consider the White Arrow not as an organization but as a social phenomenon, then its existence cannot be denied. It was a powerful and extremely influential myth, born of a vacuum of power, law, and, most importantly, justice. When the official structures of the state showed their powerlessness, society itself created a phantom that, in the imagination, was supposed to administer justice in their place. The White Arrow is not a special forces unit, but a public demand for retribution, embodied in the form of a dark urban legend. It was a cry of despair from millions of people driven to the brink by fear, chaos, and lawlessness. People so desperately wanted to believe in the existence of a force capable of punishing evil that the collective consciousness itself molded this image. The story of the White Arrow is not about heroic avengers. This is a parable about what happens when justice disappears from the streets and courtrooms. The void is always filled with vigilante justice. And vigilante justice, no matter how romantic it may seem, only leads to a new spiral of violence and chaos. Because phantoms have no charter, no clear rules, no code of honor. Ultimately, the ghost of the White Arrow disappeared not under bullets, but under the weight of the slow, imperfect, but real work of investigators, prosecutors, and judges. It was the law, with all its flaws, that proved to be the only tool that could stop this war of all against all.